So yeah, Troy will share with us how actually he applies multidisciplinary thinking to his work or his life. So please welcome him and thank you so much again.
Awesome. Hi all, I'm Troy. Multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary. I go with what I like, and it seems to get me places and has carried me around the world a couple of times now. So I'd love to show you just a little bit of what that looks like and talk about, go with what you love, and whatever that is, it's probably right. So just a quick introduction. I am the lecturer of fashion technology in the FDMCI, the Faculty of Digital Media and Creative Industries. You might think that means I work with Amphi, but it's a lot more than that. I find a lot of my time is over with blockchain and applied AI. I do a lot with the Masters of Digital Design from time to time, and I really like to tie things together. I find this to be one of the best faculties in the world to be here. I gave up a nice job in Denmark to come back to the Netherlands because of the fact that this faculty has all these crazy things bunched together. Some might say we're the leftovers that nobody else wanted. Others might say we're a really interesting experiment of putting everything together in one place and just seeing what happens. I go with the later definition because I think that's what's happening here. So it's really fun to be in a department that goes all the way from AI over to fashion design with all those steps in between. And it allows us to do some crazy fun things, especially in the minors. So as you're looking to your minors, for those of you who are still studying, or those of you who did study here, just know you have access to a lot of different areas that I think really make this place fun and interesting. So I just did my inaugural speech. You can check it out online, or I might be able to dig up a physical copy somewhere. Data as a material for fashion. I look at data not as a construct or as a amorphous idea, but as a physical thing. Data for me actually takes physical forms. If we blend data with other stuff, it becomes something. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I run the wearable data studio, where we're literally trying to physicalize data into different things. And this is our big Shimaseki knitting machine, which is downstairs in VPH. If you ever walk behind the building, you can take a look into our little dungeon there and see our fantastic little knitting machine trying to figure out what is this data as a material idea. I lead a group of some really interesting people. About half of them have fashion backgrounds, but they are all doing crazy and different things. Lizette Bonk runs the VR lab. I like to call it the Xavier lab, XR, VR, IR lab. She doesn't like to call it that. Irene Maldini is doing wardrobe studies. She likes to dig around in people's underwear drawers and count how many pairs they have. Marco's he's an economist, but he likes to look at how we sell things differently and how we can do different economic models. Micah has picked up on my love for Roman archaeology. She's doing her postdoc in archaic, ancestral, and indigenous sustainability techniques. So everything used to be sustainable, so we might just have to look to the past to figure out how we should do it in the future. Sandra's doing digital textiles. Angela is wearing green dresses for a year and taking pictures of herself like she was wearing digital fabric to understand what it would be like to wear digital fabric. It's kind of awesome and epic. We have the 3D Knit Lab, we have critical making research and design, and we have urban interaction design, all in the same group. So we try to bring these things together and do some crazy stuff with all of you in these different schools. So this is where I like to start. This is Professor Lufeis on the right there, but this is Mondrian on the left. This is a Electric Boogie Woogie, 1943. It was an unfinished painting. Mondrian unfortunately died in the middle of doing this. But in 2013, Professor Lufeis, who's covered up in the upper left-hand corner there, figured out that it had a mathematical basis to it. It could actually finish the painting by looking at its mathematical basis. So, is this painting art or is this painting math? I think we'll never know because the artist is actually dead, but it's very interesting to think that they could finish the painting by looking at the algorithm that was being used to generate it. So is all art math? No. Is all math art? No. But somewhere in between, you can find some really interesting stuff. And I think it's really fun when you start to do math and start to do other kinds of disciplines to find the art and science and find the science and art. One of my projects I'll just talk about quickly, I like to make compilers of things. How do we turn code into objects? So this is a pair of shoes that I started, ran a little shoe brand for a couple of years, blew through 60,000 in investment in a year and realized this was never ever going to be financially profitable. So here I am back teaching, but that's okay. I think that's really interesting. You have to fail a lot as we've said, to be able to say this doesn't work. But something really magic happens when you start to try to take those things that you usually draw by hand, design by hand, turning into code, teaching the code to be able to draw that in and of itself, making it parametric, being able to take that to the blockchain. We know that we can't bring patents into fashion because you can't patent clothing, but you can copyright syntax. So if you can turn it into syntax, that's copyrightable. And so all kinds of new and interesting models start to emerge as we start to talk about how do we do fashion differently. So I'm a big lover of this idea of what drives us, and working with a lot of different people. Anyway, what it says up here is that a thing is made with data, but that the thing makes more data. So that data becomes part of the thing. All these tiny little structures that are happening on the inside of the shoe here, they should usually be printed over. As they break, little bubbles start to appear on the outside. If you've ever had a big pair of United Nude shoes, you know that they start to have little warbles and crazy things happening in the big part of it as they get older. That's just material science, chemicals breaking down over time, elastic turning into plastic as it's walked on. But we now have LiDAR in all of our phones that we can just sit there and pick up, point your phone at your shoes. We can see how consumed it is, how you're walking, how you're applying your weight, and where you're applying it. So it's these kind of things that start to come out when we say, okay, we have design, we have math, we start to bring these things together, and then we have whole new financial models that can actually support it and come back to it in the end. So we're in this really kind of awesome Wild West time, because only now that we have, thanks to all those Bitcoin miners, we have graphics cards that can actually handle this kind of level of processing and allow us to start to do some wild and crazy things with this as their video cards get way too fast. So here's the classic Troy lesson. What is the material you see on the left? What material is this? Silk. Silk? Good call. Anybody else caught something? Most people call it satin. Might just because we have the people on top of it. But satin is not actually a material. Satin is a weave. Satin, what happens is when you kind of put one every 8 dots so that it's actually spanning a very large area, making it look soft and shiny because it's all compacted together. It can be made out of silk, it can be made out of polyester, it can be made out of a million things, but it's actually a structure. And yet most people think of it as a material. That led me to start thinking, is data a material? And I started looking at the other materials that we make clothes out of, like there's Jill Sanders' sweater here. There's alpaca, cotton, lana, polyamide, and then cupro and elastan. I mean, there's a ton of materials that have all come together to make this thing. And at the same time, if we look at the kind of details that are happening in the weave and in the knit that makes these things, it's also got data in it. And that data, if they didn't have data in it, it would all be just one color. But when they start to put data into it, this experience of it changes dramatically. So if that data is changing it, is that data not just another one of those materials that's being mixed and blended together to make the thing? We can argue that. I'd love to. This is the kind of thing I like to argue with people, and lots of people from different disciplines, because especially computer scientists have some very keen ideas about this, that they don't like me calling it a material, but I really believe it is. Anything that has a materiality. This is the Viberg model of methodologies for materiality coming from human-computer interaction, where he says that materiality is actually just a meaning. It's something that we as humans interpret, and that has a wholeness to it, how it's composed, the things it's composed of, and the meaning of those compositions, our past experience with materials. And so that materiality is formed from this idea of wholeness, which is based upon texture, details, and the materials that it's made out of. Why does a Mac have a more authentic feel? Because it's actually made in metal, whereas lots of other computers are plastic that are made to look like metal. So those are some things, some ideas in appearance and authenticity. What I really find key to that is how we use data to change those things. That data enables us to experience things. And if data is a material, it means data's been a material for a hell of a long time, at least 350 years as we go back to the invention of punch cards and the jacquard machine to actually make textiles look differently. This is also the original keyboard. If you talk about the keyboards on your computers these days, 350 years ago on the jacquard machine, manual selections for punching the cards. So we've been doing this thing with data for a hell of a long time. So these punch cards in themselves are a representation of data and paper coming together, data as a material. But it isn't until you kind of get computer scientists looking backwards as to where did computers come from that you start to realize that this thing that we've been working with for so long might just be a material that we can look at as a material. There's this idea of form language that I think is really important to what's going on today as well. We speak in forms, we compose things as designers. We have this compositional meaning that drives us. And whether it's pixels on a screen or whether it's fabric that's going to be worn in some sort of weird cyborg way, because when we put on clothes, it becomes part of us. And so if this is a technology made with data, I'm just a cyborg simply by wearing these clothing or wearing these clothes, because once it's on me, I forget that it's there. But there's an underlying form language that drives all of these things. We can create forms in this. And some of those things that we learn as designers and creatives especially are really transferable. We can take these ideas from building little doll houses, architectural models, they're just doll houses, like that, and the interfaces, or to the interfaces that we build. We can connect these disparate things because we understand form language, and we understand how that math drives those form languages very often. I think that's really fascinating, that once you can start to understand form language and the human body, you can pretty much switch between computer science, fashion design, and everything in between, architecture, quite liberally. And I think it's something that Brunelleschi understood very well. If you go to the cupola in Florence, go to see the inside of it, which is suffering greatly because of the way he designed it. The outside's great, but you also see how many human beings he put on there and what he was thinking about as he was making it.
So you mean syntax is also form language?
Syntax drives form language now, and syntax can be form language, but if we think about syntax creating form language, we've connected computer science and design in a way that opens up new territory and allows us to do lots of crazy new things. Is that easy? No. We have to be able to think about form language and think about syntax at the same time. So I'm very proud of those of you who did programming as kids, because it's really opening up new things. We have enough digital natives now that if we can kind of make people who are digital natives and physical natives, we can start to open up all kinds of new territory. But that really often takes this kind of multidisciplinary idea, bringing in the right people, getting things together. So this is an illustration that I did with Lily Eva Bartha. We had an artist in residency last year where we were really asking, what is fashion when it's mathematically driven? And she's a mathematician that also went to Royal College of Art to do fashion. I too have a programming background. I in the first internet bubble, was writing some of the original websites back in New York City. Zalando, not Zalando, it was Cosmo, things you wouldn't even recognize now, but they laid down all of the early ideas for Amazon and what it's become today. But if we come to this idea, we were looking at how can we parametrically generate clothing on the body, and what does it take to mathematically do that and drive that? And we came up with this really interesting digital fashion that's now become a company. I can't, from this project, we were parametrically generating clothing in real time. So this was all done actually in VR, which has to run at runtime. It actually worked. Lily got the Starts Prize that was mentioned earlier. She now has more money than she knows what to do with in her company, and hardly takes my calls. But that's just how these things launch, and I'm very proud of her for what we're doing there. We just had the simple idea of generative fashion based upon movement and what the body was doing, and what that would mean in the metaverse to have clothing that's growing on you mathematically based upon your action. And we have one that when people look at you, it grows, and when people don't look at you, you become naked again. So it's all of this kind of peripheral nudity. But when somebody looks at you, the clothing drops. So if people are looking directly at you, I think it plays with some really interesting ideas of self-identity and what's going on there. I'll take a moment to promote some books. I guess one of the actual manifesto items in my group, what we do there is that we understand fashion critically and holistically as designerly, artistic, and scientific, impacting in ways that are socio-technical and socio-aesthetic. We understand that there are technical systems, there are aesthetic systems, and that we only really understand them by doing both. We have to look at things from an artistic perspective, from a designerly perspective, and a scientific perspective to truly understand the thing that has come in front of us. And there's a really fun book, it's a little hard to read, but it is a design book that I really love, called Drifting by Intention. It's by Peter Krogh and Kulskin, where they talk about this idea of moving between these. And they actually really detail what it means to go from an artistic practice to a scientific practice to a designerly practice, and to do it in different ways and what you can expect to learn along there. The kind of epistemology is saying, how do we know what we know? And so as we know it in these different ways, we develop a deeper and more holistic understanding of things. So if you want to get really deep in on the subject, on the philosophical end of it, go read that. If you want something a little bit easier to read, Things We Could Design for More Than Human Worlds. We had Ron Bukhari in this space last week talking about his brand new book. This is talking about constituency. What are the people and the things that we put together to make the things that we make? Whether that's a crosswalk, whether that's a table that moves around on its own, whether it's anything. This idea of constituency is really important. Who we put in the room to make the thing will define the thing that comes out. So this idea of becoming post-disciplinary or multidisciplinary is really important, because as we start to put people together, it's all about who we put together that really drives the thing that's going to be made. And so Ron runs the Everyday Design Studio in Vancouver. He's constantly putting different groups together just to see what they come up with and how those different roles really drive new kinds of innovation. That was the big. Good. A couple more slides. I love these slides. Were not created to show on Zoom. My apologies. So really quickly move this over to this side, which is this side that's more accessible. Put it over there. Thank you. Awesome. What I really love about multidisciplinary design and really working in this and having done it for decades at this point, constantly looking for scientists to come in on fashion projects essentially, is that we come up with new understandings of what fashion even is. We get this chance to redefine the disciplines that we are working in. So lots of people think that fashion is anything that's really expensive sold by Louis Vuitton. And I like to challenge that idea. I see fashion as any technology that envelops the body. Whether that technology is the woven or the knitted thing that we're wearing, whether it's an Apple Watch that's digitally on our wrists, any kind of technology that it comes into the human sphere that we put on, then do something with, I call technology. So your cell phone, when it's not being held in your hand and actively worked on, the moment you put it in your pocket, it becomes a worn technology. And we all know that just because the screen is off on our cell phones doesn't mean that our cell phone isn't doing anything at that point. It's still tracking our location and telling everybody in the world where we are right now, other than the people that we'd actually like to know. But that's really interesting, because as it becomes a worn on the body technology, all kinds of things happen there. There's fashion implications for it. There's computer science implications for it. There's social and sociological implications for it. There's probably some psychological things that happen along the way as well. Not my field. That's where I call in psychologists. But this idea that fashion is any technology that envelops the body, I find really important. I also like this idea by Marc Jacobs, is that clothes mean nothing until someone lives in them. So we have to get people actually living in them. What's important to multidisciplinary design is actually watching the people, not actually looking at the disciplines, and looking at them from different perspectives and getting all those people in the same room to look at those perspectives.
Troy, you can minimize that column of screens.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
If you on the top and then on the left, top left, there's this little
I
bar.
drop out of the presentation to do that.
Yeah.
Awesome. So much better. Oh no,
And then the play button.
all my notes.
Yeah.
Another part of this is that fashion is made and worn with data as a material. I think everything is actually made and worn with data as a material. I just find fashion to be the easiest way to describe it, because, well, we all wear clothes. At least everybody in this room is wearing clothes. And the very few people that don't wear clothes like to talk about textiles a lot, because they are always talking about places where they have to wear clothes. So they engage with the technology from a probably even more informed perspective than most of us actually do. So I really love this idea that as we engage with clothing, we are engaging with data as a material. And that allows us to look at it from these multiple perspectives and to bring in all of the different people who engage with clothing in its different forms. You know, you have the analysis of fashion, you have the design of fashion, you have the manufacturing of fashion, you have the use of fashion. Most of fashion happens inside of people's closets when they're using the thing. And yet fashion, like lots of industries, likes to imagine that the relationship ends at the point of sale. The moment they've sold it, they can forget about it. And yet we know that not to be true. We have to actually go deeper. We have to look at it. We have to keep looking at it if we're ever going to achieve anything like sustainability, circularity, or regenerative. And the final thing that I really think is really interesting as we start to look at it in this different place, and I'd love to take this out to a larger understanding, but fashion is the craftsmanship of wearing clothes. It's dress. Every day when you get dressed, you are practicing fashion. You are practicing doing it better. And in that practice, you become a master of it. You are finding your own style. You are taking a set. You are understanding what does it mean to wear clothes by the simple act of doing it. And so we need to look at this idea of craftsmanship a lot closer in many different disciplines, because every time somebody does something, their understanding of it develops and grows. And to do that, it's hard to do from a singular perspective. You need lots of disciplines coming in on this and helping us inform what happens in each of those moments as we do something. Because so much of what we don't do consciously. We do on a peripheral level. And we're constantly engaged with the next level of it. So some examples that I really like of this. We just did a sweater. We took this paper called A Cellular Automaton for Pied de Poule. This is just how. And they did a really nice woven version of this, but we tried to understand how can we do an algorithm that can generate a pattern like houndstooth. And thankfully, Lou Feist did most of the work for us already because he's a big lover of houndstooth. What's really interesting is when you start to do knitting with that and try to do a different understanding. And I'm hoping you can see it better. Yeah, this is one of those things that if you have it really big on the screen, doesn't make sense at all. But you can start to see how little forms of houndstooth form in this and then go away and come back again. We can make algorithms that can write different kinds of style. And I think this is really fascinating, that these patterns of houndstooth come in and go out. They arrive for a while and go away again, and other patterns develop and emerge from inside of this. So I think it's really kind of interesting when we start working with other disciplines that we can come to things that are very classic, and then those classic things lead us into areas that are not classic at all. And we start to see the innovation at the interface between these two, this kind of classic and modernism happening. And so I'm hoping you're all doing that in your own work, because that's what we're trying to do in the Wearable Data Studio. And if you'd ever like to come over and say hi and take a look at what we made, and we have a brand new blue version of this that just came out yesterday. It's a little bit different, and we're constantly experimenting with what happens there. But we also asked some meta questions for this. How does fashion change if we use data as a material? But I think we can really ask, how do all the different fields change if we start using data as a material to work in that field and to bring these disciplines together? My own work has identified that we start doing a lot of different things that fashion can't describe yet. And we have to be okay with that ambiguity. There are things that, like social media has a lot of ambiguity to it, that we just keep going at it. And eventually somebody smarter than us will try to describe it. And I'm okay with that, as you know, even with a PhD, I don't have to describe it myself. That job is for somebody else to describe it. We'll figure out what it is, they'll figure out what it's called. Additionally, how does technology change when we make fashion with data? How does that whole systemic view of what we're doing change as we start to work inside of that data-enabled field? So I encourage you that when you're doing this kind of work, don't only look at how is it changing your discipline, ask yourself, how does it change those other disciplines that you're working with as well? Because your perspective coming from a foreign discipline is probably more interesting and important in that moment. You have a lot more to tell them than you can actually say about your own field. And it's in those interactions that that magic really happens. For example, we found these kind of steps of encoding, materializing, profiling, and even some digital twinning. It's available right down there. And that's interesting to think we can digital twin and do that whole weird twinning thing right down there inside of fashion as well. Well, knowledge engineering. That's what it's supposed to say for some reason. I think it got mixed up in there. There's a name for this, and it's called knowledge engineering. It's coming out of AI sciences. AI is really good at doing math and doing the AI part. They're really terrible because they're that kind of computer science at talking to other people and getting into other fields and working with people. And so a lot of what we've been doing recently is really just doing that knowledge engineering. How do you create a common language between fashion designers and AI computer scientists? Now, it usually takes somebody who's a translator, who can speak both, and who can start to explaining to both groups what's happening there. So the last thing I'd like to encourage you guys all to do is try to learn a different discipline and try to translate it for people. You'll find yourself, especially with those people who are really hardcore, who are really at the height of their different fields, they're going to be really difficult with this. Like I have a friend, Admar, he does capacitive sensing, and he's a genius at it. And we've built sensors that allow you to watch the foot and build shoes automatically, generatively, parametrically build a shoe. But one day I accidentally started using photographic terminology with Admar as to how we're going to build this. And he just looked at me blankly. He's like, I have no idea what you're saying. And that's what you have to realize when you're interfacing with people. How multidisciplinary are they? How much of the language can they translate? How can you bring them in by helping them translate their discipline into a different discipline? So I'll leave it with that. Does anybody have any questions, or can we talk and have some questions of each other?
Yes, we can take questions.
Let's clap a little bit.
Back to a slide that actually has a name there. Knowledge. Oh, wait, no, go. Anyway, knowledge engineering. I learned the term from the head of AI at ASML, because that's all she does all day long anymore. It's because at ASML, you're working with a very limited number of chip making machines. All they do is microchips. She's like, I don't have enough microchip machines to actually make a data set that can tell us anything about these machines. So she started looking at textile machines at the same time. So there's a few more textile machines than there are. And in finding the similarities between a textile manufacturing machine and a silicon manufacturing machine, she found ways of informing both. So I borrow that term from Kunigunde. Great. Questions? Yeah.
I'm curious on how did you first decided to follow fashion? So like, how were you interested in the first place?
Oh, that's
Fashion.
a long time ago. So I grew up in Wyoming. I too, seen a bit of the world. I went from Wyoming to New York City, to Florence, Brunelleschi's Dome. I lived with for 15 years, and then moved on to up here. I can remember distinctly saying when Calvin Klein was moving up here with PVH from Warnaco, I told him, no, I'm not moving, and I'll never move to the Netherlands, only to get a PhD here 2 years later. So how did I first get into fashion? I like complexity. And I think, I love picking apart complex areas. And data science and fashion are equally as complex. I, in fact, find fashion to be even more complex than data science, because in data science, you can find patterns and stick them down. In fashion, we don't record the data well enough down. So I think it's a funner area just because of the complexity that it offers. And so I think in actually being a field engineer, internet boom, I just wanted something that was actually more complex than what I was doing then. And so that's when I decided to go back and do a fashion bachelor's. Good question.
I like how you made a negative definition of an anti-definition of what we normally think of as fashion, and as well kind of a different idea of what a material is. The thing where you showed like that we understand materials as something that we can grab, something that has texture. The example with the satin was really great, right? Because it's actually a structure, but the way that we talk about it or conceptualize it often is as a material. But then I thought that was really kind of eye-opening, like not even because you try to say that we want to see data as a material, right? But the way the kind of 4 pillars that you showed, to have that when is something a material? I started thinking of a cloud, for example. Like, can we consider a cloud as a material? It's H2O floating around in the sky.
Can't grab it.
But you can't grab it.
You can stick your head in it in the morning and definitely get wet from it, but
but is that a material, or does it have materiality?
Yeah, I find this concept of materiality to be really key to understanding what we're doing, especially in the digital physical realities that we live in right now. Because so much of what we can do can flip-flop. When we design something digitally, is it a shoe? I would say so. It's just a shoe in digital form. We then materialize it into a physical form, but then we can study that physical form and take it back into a digital form. And we make lots of things that are half and half. Our iPhone is a really great black mirror, until we actually turn the screen on, and then it takes, it goes from a physical reality to a digital reality pretty quickly. And supposedly back again, though I'm smart enough to know that it's doing all kinds of things, the accelerometer and everything, even when the screen's turned off. Because when I lift it up to my face, it will turn itself on.
It's about experience, right? It's I think even phenomenology.
Phenomenology, but
It's the way that things appear to us, right?
But post-phenomenology as well. We take that phenomenon and we turn it into an emotional meaning,
Yeah.
we turn it into a philosophical meaning in that moment as well. And so, yeah, as a designer, I'm very empirical. I like to make stuff and then write about it sometimes. But mostly making the stuff is what I enjoy. But yeah, there's that meaning that comes into it post-phenomenologically that's really fascinating. If you ever get a chance, Peter Paul Verbeek, who's right here in Enschede, probably the leader worldwide of that.
I'm thinking that especially with the materiality, when it comes to what is physical and what is not something that you can touch, it is indeed something really epistemologically centered. So if we think also about music, what is it material or not? It's a question that was discussed by Popper with the three walls, whether something is physical or not. So the brain of the creator is physical, but then the idea is not. It becomes again physical when it's translated to something, even if that's music. So the Fifth of Beethoven is a typical example.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a material thing or is it not?
I would take it to if I was taking it from the phenomenological perspective, so like the actual physical thing, the act of actually being music requires that atoms of air are moved and vibrated in very specific ways. So it's being translated back into a physical material. It's just, again, a cloud that we cannot see. The sound is happening because of the physical interaction happening.
And that's interesting because the individual molecules have no idea that they're part of a music piece. So they themselves, even though they are the individual physical representation, it's only because in the relationship to the others that they become something different.
Constituent meanings.
Yeah.
If we don't have all those air particles there, the thing making the noise in our ears and our brains that are capable of translating it, is it a thing?
But also style, now that we're connected also with fashion, style cannot exist by, so if you're just a person alone, if you're a Robinson Crusoe, you cannot claim for yourself that you have style because it's a relationship. Already somebody has to view that. Already style or what you're wearing, I consider it as some kind of encoding because it's your personality, your ideas, your mood for the day. And basically people have to interpret this code when they see you.
Yes and no. There's also, I would agree with it in one sense, but there's also a psychological sense to fashion, where if you compare what you're wearing day after day after day, you could actually come to an own sense of style. If you were a single person on an island by yourself, but you need that temporality to it. You have to say, oh, yesterday I wore that, and the day before yesterday I wore this, and it's day number 367, and I'm still wearing the same grass skirt. What does that mean? But yeah, I think that there's a comparison there that I think is really important. What's the French word for fashion?
La mode.
La mode. Where do we find mode? Where does the word mode come from?
Modes of viewing things. Modes of.
There's many definitions of it, but the original one is repetition in music. It's the note that appears the most and how those things come back in symphony and harmony. So this idea of mode is just the thing that happens the most often. And so you can look at it from that perspective of fashion is just the thing that happens the most often. So if you're the person on the island, it's just the thing that you wear the most over a temporal amount of time. But I think it's much more exciting when you get it in large groups of people and we start to interact. Yes.
Exactly, but if you think about it philosophically, it's a typical question about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody listens to it, does it make a sound?
Do trees wear clothes?
One could say that,
One
and
could
they
make a
do
strong
change
argument
it
for it, yeah.
temporarily.
And it probably does make a sound if you're an empirical phenomenologist like me. But post-phenomenology has its own opinions, I suspect.
I'm thinking also about quantum computing, because if you say something like data, it also it raises certain ideas or concepts about ones and zeros and digital data. But if you think about that, where computing is going, quantum computing, it's probabilistic, and again about viewing and about interpreting. You you influence the thing that you're looking at when you look at it.
Yeah.
And the top spin or the down spin can be it's multiple things at once, right? So that has a certain that data is even more clearly grounded in a sort of fabric of the universe or materiality.
Well, the same could be said does it be true about fashion? We influence the thing that we're looking at when we look at it. It's our interactions with people that actually drive the way we dress. And so, yeah, I would draw direct connections between quantum computing and quantum physics and fashion. I think I have in a paper before addressed that idea that they do both kind of look at the same thing. It's just from phenomenological or post-phenomenological or philosophical perspective.
Or if you see it sociologically, right now with quantum computing, it's applied on several organizations on corporate level because they're trying to predict people's behaviors through data, and it's exactly the same. It's patterns that you identify to people, and now they're trying to predict their next move, which is the most difficult thing in technology.
Well, I've always loved the idea that Amazon will actually have the things showing up on my doorstep at the moment that I thought I would like to buy it. You know, and the only question is, do I send it back or not? Because that becomes a really fascinating reality, where the things we think, with the things that we want, they already knew it, and they can start to control how close they were. I started randomly going on AliExpress and buying things for random people that I know, not telling them that it's me who's sending them this weird stuff, just because it's financially available. And just to see if they end up wearing it, do they end up actually integrating it into their lives? What do they do with this random stuff that's just showing up on their doorstep? Trying to test some of that. My brother-in-laws hate me. But yeah, that's a fascinating idea, because style has patterns and style has repetition. It has a mode. And that mode is, you know, if we look to the definition of music, ideas of symphony, harmony, different things happening in music, we can actually start to do some of that predictive analysis. And I think it's the best, you know, it's one of the more interesting places that we already find a definition for it. And fashion has adopted it, but you know, what happens when computer scientists don't get there?
If you think about fashion as like, you can go along with the stream, you can accept the packets that are delivered to your door without questioning, or you can decide, like, I don't agree with this, I'm going to do something different. I think that's, you know, related to Masaki's presentation, thinking about fashion and thinking about art. And I was thinking, oh, well, there's also something about a kind of resistance or in people, or like something where a drive comes from to do something differently. Yeah, he spoke also about the think different. How can we think differently? But that's kind of the crux, I think. If you talk about fashion, also, where does a style come from? What is authentic? What is?
How can we drive that mechanism of where does fashion come from?
Yeah.
And TV figured that out quite a few years ago. But this is where the multidisciplinary design comes in. How do we actually get those right people in the room? So the idea that I borrow from Ron Macaria's constituency, how do I get these ideas to come out based upon who's in that room, who's designing the thing, how are they going to interact together? How can we predict what they're going to make based upon who is in that room? And that's where it gets to be really fascinating, is that we don't have enough rooms full of disparate kinds of people yet.
And the combinations could be
Fascinating and predictable.
I'm looking at the time. It's 6:39, so we're exactly 1 hour into the meetup. We can, of course, stay a little bit and chat, but maybe we should officially
close
it.
So thank you so much, Troy, for an amazing presentation, and also thank you so much for your interaction and questions, interesting ideas. So again, I'm going to organize more events. I also have another one tomorrow at WeWork, having a Spanish artist who has implemented a seismic sensor in her body. It could be also interesting topic for you guys. So if you have time, please join us tomorrow. And again, thank you so much for having us today, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation.
copy my little book.
Thank you so much.
And maybe we can have some material after the presentation. So the books that were offered or some ideas from you, Masaki, maybe we can find this somewhere, the slides, let's say.
If you go to the, I only have one with me, sorry, but if you look up data as a material for fashion, most of it's right there.
All right, good.
I just made that book and for the inaugural, and a lot of these ideas are in that.
And what about the book? So that you had it somewhere.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
things we could
I
design for
didn't
more
know.
than human-centered
Sorry.
worlds.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ron Macari.